whisper to me, like, you don't have to tell everybody. Colin Lobser, please come take your seat. He's with Hive Energy and supported by his colleagues. You just can't miss them. They also look like, I think they've got more energy inside their bodies. They look nicely built, don't they, in those shirts. And of course, last but not least, the GM of ArcelorMittal, Aldrich Louis, please take your seat. Thank you. I will take this side, because I already have one. Did someone from GIZ lose their pocketbook? Okay, we'll do a lost and found if there's something written inside. It's a notebook, so I'm scared to check if something has been written inside it, because if it is not, I might just expropriate it for myself. But as we kick off this conversation, as we are talking about, you know, green economies, the green, you know, industrialization, it's almost a revolution of sorts, as some people have been saying in different panels earlier, Minister, and some people saying, are we over-optimistic that there's going to be this, you know, green hydrogen economic revolution? And some people are quite optimistic that it is going to happen. And of course, in a panel that I come from just now, some people were then talking about, you know, the questions to learn from the mining industry in terms of how do you make sure that communities where, you know, this green hydrogen is being enabled are not left behind, and we make sure that we remember making sure that there are certain programs put in place by companies playing in those communities to make sure that there's development of those communities, there's skills in those communities, there's jobs in those communities, and maybe not an overpromise at times of the capacity and capabilities for jobs to be created. But I suppose there's absolute potential for South Africa, as government has been saying, to you know, play a leading role in the globe in this space of green hydrogen economy. And part of that is about building local manufacturing capacity, because we've always been seen as a consumer, and rather than, you know, the builder, the manufacturer, and so on. And earlier on, when the president was here, some people spoke about, you know, Africa setting the price rather than Africa, you know, receiving the price, and so on. So, Minister Patel, I'd like to start off with you on this session and talk about, you know, when we talk about manufacturing facilities, they've got to be globally competitive. They've got to meet global standards in whatever sector they may be. Insofar as this, you know, green energy, green hydrogen economy, how would you say that government is making sure that it enables and facilitates that conducive environment for, you know, globally competitive manufacturing to take place? And what learnings can we take and adopt or adapt from other industries where we've been quite successful? For example, the automotive industry. Actually, when I was at the BMF policy conference, you spoke about somebody who makes parts for Mercedes-Benz and, you know, lauded them in how they meet global standards all the way from South Africa. How do we make sure we take lessons from that kind of example that, you know, you share quite enthusiastically to make sure that for the green hydrogen economy, we are able to have local manufacturing that will meet global standards?
Well, first, thank you very much, and good afternoon both to the panelists and to members of the audience. I'd like perhaps to frame your question about competitiveness in manufacturing with a few contextual comments within which we need to look at that competitiveness challenge. And I start with the observation that I think members of the audience will share, that the world is changing rapidly, and there's space for countries that are nimble and smart. That we are on the cusp. It's a key moment. Enough forces are coming together, from climate change to the deep lessons of COVID-19, that is changing the way in which policymakers and corporations are thinking about the world, for us to have an opportunity that South Africa can utilize, can exploit. We have some advantages. We have some natural advantages: land, wind, solar energy, the oceans, and of course our endowment of minerals, critical minerals for the value chains we're going to talk about. But we've also have some, if you like, acquired advantage. We have a petrochemical technology and base that can be utilized in quite important ways in the transition to green hydrogen. And we have a fabrication capability in South Africa that is illustrated on the one hand by traditional industries like steel making, and by the success that South Africa has had in automobile production. You mentioned an example that I had given in a different conference, and it was essentially talking about a black industrialist that was now making critical components for Mercedes-Benz vehicles, the C-Class. Now, the C-Class vehicle is produced in only 3 locations in the world: Bremen in Germany, Beijing in China, and Buffalo City in South Africa. You need a B in your name to qualify for the C-Class. But the point out of that is the bulk of Mercedes-Benz vehicles are exported to other parts of the world. A small percentage of what we produce locally is consumed in the domestic market. So we need to meet the fabrication requirements of consumer markets across the world. When you walk around in the UK or in New York City and you see a C-Class vehicle, chances are it was made in South Africa. And for a black industrialist to have been able to meet and exceed all the technical requirements to be able to do the components that are in that vehicle is just one of many illustrations of the technological capability that South Africa has. So I've spoken about the natural endowment, I've spoken about the acquired ability, and then we have a moment, a transition moment. And the transition moment is founded on this. Africa's industrialization is absolutely and without any question necessary. We have 18% of the world's population are African, living on the continent. We account for 3% of global GDP and less than 1% of local steel production or auto production. So over the next number of years, the question of industrialization on the continent is going to be front and center. What path of industrialization do we take? The world can't afford that newcomers to industrialization take the same path that Europe and the United States took. And therein lies an opportunity to say that if we want to have a more sustainable path, we need to do it in a partnership in which resources are made available for us to take a different set of technological choices. And that for me is where the heart of it is. So let me come then to your question more narrowly, which is the industrialization opportunity, fabrication. By the way, it's in a wide range of things, and I would like to say that South Africa should position itself not only to be manufacturers of some components, but to look at that entire ecosystem. The R&D, it's critical. The fabrication, of course. The logistics system, getting green hydrogen to market, not only domestically, but also globally. And so we've developed a green commercialization strategy that has that as its center. What are the lessons in it we've learned from the successful examples of industrialization? The auto industry is a good example, and I would lift out 3 or 4 lessons that could be relevant here. The first is a regulatory clarity. You need to know what you're doing. Investors need to know what will be the legal and other frameworks, what are the quid pro quos. All of that has to be understood and transparent. Transparency encourages confidence. And when people are going to put money into new technologies and a new market, they need to know what the road looks like. The second thing is demand. Demand was absolutely critical in the auto industry and will be in green hydrogen. We needed to square a circle. We are a tiny country, 60 million consumers. We want to attract an OEM to produce cars here, whereas they can go and locate in many bigger countries in the world. And so we did so through negotiating these free trade agreements with Europe and later with the United Kingdom. And we had, of course, preferential access via the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act to the United States. Now, in the green hydrogen space, it's not a free trade agreement you're looking for. You're looking for preferential procurement arrangements, offtake commitments from the global north. The third lesson for me out of our experience in the auto industry is the role of incentives. We needed to find a sustainable and an affordable way of addressing some of the gaps between the cost of production and the price that consumers were prepared to pay. And so we found it in a scheme that we developed, an auto master plan, as we call it now, and that has assisted quite significantly. I want to make, as my concluding comment though, while we can learn a lot from the auto industry and from what we've done there, and many of those lessons can be applied here, there's one difference in green hydrogen that we would need to confront. And I'll call it a gap. It's a demand gap and a price gap. The price of green hydrogen compared to competing technologies at the moment for much of the potential application is not there yet. And so we need bridges between today and the time when the technology catches up and we're able to bring unit price down. We can't stand, the world can't afford to wait until technological innovation creates a cost competitive opportunity against competing technologies. So we've got to be able to mobilize resources to cover that breach. And the second gap is a demand gap. These two are obviously linked. And so to the extent that we have greater public sector push across the world, it can't be done by South Africa alone, to absorb green hydrogen in energy systems, the more we'd be able to have a commercially viable path for the development of green hydrogen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Patel. Thank you very much for those opening remarks. And I suppose that takes us to the IDC. I mean, Minister Mahandra is talking about resources, and that's something you have, with, of course, expectations in how you roll them out. But you've also participated, you know, in setting up some manufacturing for renewable energies. But there's still, you know, the challenges of making sure that these local facilities are cost competitive, they are cost effective, and of course there would be, you know, offtake agreements and all of that. What is the role that you should be playing as DFIs in this, and of course just the wider financing sector, as we think through about, you know, making sure that there will be local manufacturing for the green hydrogen economy. But also some people have complained about, you know, the lack of finance when you're at the product development, you know, life cycle, where there's no commercialization and so on, and sometimes that's where you need money the most. And what does IDC do in that process? Do you, you know, find some venture capital to partner up with development funders and so on? Is it something that you are going to add in one of your portfolios at the IDC, so that you make sure that in the product development life cycle, people are not, you know, just squeezing the little they have out of their savings, out of their pockets that they draw down and all of that, to make sure that there's some seed funding that is available, including if an idea might not make it to commercialization?
Thank you, and good afternoon to Minister, panelists, and to all of you. It's great to be here. Thank you very much. This is an area I'm very passionate about talking about. You know, I think as an introductory remark, we speaking about a lot of important things we want to do, and this is what we're trying to do is extremely important for a number of reasons. But with that in mind, we also need to be aware of the challenges ahead of us. And we do know that it's extremely important why we're doing this, but what will help us push forward with these challenges is firstly understanding the why part of it. Okay, we all need to be aligned on why we're developing this new green hydrogen industry. And we have, you know, summarized that into a few key areas. One of the big whys is that it will enable us to export products. support the local economy by doing that. We want to address a real export market. The second big why is, and with every challenge comes an opportunity. There's the challenge about ensuring that we address socio-economic aspects, the just transition, but with that challenge comes the opportunity for you to make sure you do it right from the start. We always talk about decarbonization, but it is a decarbonization opportunity that we're doing. So that's the third why, right? And finally, the fourth why, as Minister spoke to it about, is the fact that we have competitive advantages that we can utilize to position South Africa as a globally competitive player. Now, this links very much into the reason why we want to address the localization part, the industrialization part, is because we believe that by addressing that, in the longer term, when we're developing this new industry, it's going to give us that global comparative advantage. We do have, and a number of reasons for that, we do have a lot of the minerals in the various supply chains. It's not only the hydrogen supply chain with PGMs, it's also your battery supply chain, your renewable equipment supply chain. So a number of supply chains. We do have endowments in that area. We believe that if we create those equipment industries in the country, it's going to give us, by utilizing those input materials, give us a longer-term comparative advantage. With that in mind, going back to what us as DFIs can do, I think one of the key things is to understand that another part of the challenge is addressing the supply-demand, what we call the chicken egg situation. And one of our key approaches is the whole value chain approach, firstly. It's not only addressing the supply part, the demand part in parallel, and in the middle, that equipment manufacturing part. So as we support the production of green hydrogen and green ammonia, in parallel, we also support investments into the applications like green mobility, like we're now looking at the green steel production as an example. So that value chain approach is very important. Then going back to the whole issue about the role of project development and venture capital funding. Now, we want to get the balance right between commercializing off-the-shelf technology and supporting new technology. So there's a distinction between product development and project development we need to get right, okay? Both very important, but we need to get the balance right. So when we do project development for commercialization, that's very important to get the new industry started. In the longer run, innovation will also give us that longer-term comparative advantage. You always need to keep abreast of innovation. Innovation and venture capital funding that requires needs to be done very strategically. So I'll give you an example of that. So while we want to develop those commercial ready technologies, there's certain aspects in the value chain that need innovation to unblock it. One key example is storage and distribution. Right? We need innovation to bring the costs down there. And what I mean by strategically, we need to say, okay, although we want to support off-the-shelf stuff, we need to see that within storage and transportation, that's where we need to address the R&D part. So IDC plays a role in project development. We take technology that's ready for commercialization, put in the equity risk there. So we put in equity risk and in the feasibility phases to develop those projects. However, there is a gap in the funding gap between pre-commercialization of products. There isn't enough funds. And I think the role of DFIs is to be flexible in that regards and taking a bit more risk in developing certain technologies strategically.
Okay.
And I think we are quite flexible to that. I know that our partner DFIs are also very open into that area.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much, Mahendra, for those remarks. And Thabo, let me bring you in here. I mean, of course, this is something that you can't ignore as you play in multiple industries yourselves. But when we think about equipment that is there, whether it's plant equipment, some other equipment that is there and is common between the current energy sector today and the green hydrogen sector, what are we looking at? And of course, how do we make sure that we set up some sustainable supply chains that can serve both industries? So that, I mean, somebody asked in the last panel, is this going to be a competition? Is this going to be some cooperation? How do we make sure that between the energy sector and the green hydrogen value chains that are emerging, especially given that for it to be a just transition, some people have said, well, you'd need some communities that are already part of the energy generation space not to lose out when we decommission our coal plants and so on, to make sure that perhaps there can be a substitution effect of newer industries, more sustainable energy generating sources.
So thank you for the opportunity, and to the esteemed panel members. I guess from our side, this question, maybe the question on localization, I'll delve a bit deeper on that one, and then touch on the elements of the differences in the two energy systems. So we get this question everywhere we go. Every country that Siemens Energy is in, there's always a conversation around what can be localized, how can we localize, how quickly can we localize. And then after that question comes the question of whether is it going to be a sustainable localization effort and so on. So our observation has been that, first of all, when you get the question internally, then we sit and we realize that, and also the minister has alluded, this is a global competition. We have to position ourselves very well in order to take advantage of those localization opportunities. But I also like the example where we can build from our position of strength. You know, green hydrogen is not new. Maybe, I suppose, the color could be the topic of today, but hydrogen itself as an energy carrier, it's not new. I mean, it was done in the 60s in Egypt. Zimbabwe had one, Sasol has got one. So we're not talking about something that is foreign, we're not talking about something that is new. I mention this because all the other accompanying equipment around hydrogen exists. The skill sets that rest around maintaining it, installing it around, maybe if we ring fence the electrolyzer itself, around the electrolyzer exists. The piping, the welding that has to happen, the fabrication, the assemblies that needs to happen, those exist locally. So I think from a transition perspective, we are not starting from zero, we're starting from a position of strength. However, I think in the localization discussion, we don't emphasize enough around making sure that we are stronger on the operation and maintenance aspect. Because it's very difficult to try and compete at a manufacturing level because it requires R&D, and R&D requires funding, and Mahendra has touched on it, that it is a bit of a tricky space to go into. So rather strengthen something that you can maintain for 20 plus years, build your skill sets there, because it helps you to also have a good pipeline of trainees, good pipeline of graduates and so on to build your skill space. So I think that's an important point that we need to look at. Then there's another issue around, which I call supplemental topics, which is the quality aspect, you know, that also ties into the skill. But the biggest lever then becomes volume. You know, without sufficient volume, we then are not making a sustainable investment. And therefore we create jobs that would not be there in 5 years' time, or we spend money in a space that would not otherwise have been sustainable. And I think this is where the conversation normally gets a bit tense around what is that sustainable volume and loading that we can have for this facility or for this industry and so forth.
No, thank you so much. And I suppose talking about volumes, that's why Colin is sort of like excitedly nodding his head because as a project developer, I mean, how can you be, one, be made to buy local, but secondly, I mean, yourselves and other people playing in spaces such as, for example, ammonia projects. We're talking to one earlier this morning. How does it look like to create that volume in order to encourage and boost the idea of local manufacturing for the green hydrogen economy?
Thank you very much, Minister Patel, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity. Before I start, I just want to say there's been a bromance going on here between the Northern Cape and the Western Cape. We're from the Eastern Cape, so don't leave us. And thank you, Minister Patel, for mentioning the automotive industry, because that's one of the key drivers of what we do. And to answer your question, we didn't come here not thinking about this. In fact, this dominated our thoughts. Before we made the decision to come here, which was our first country in this project, we also do Chile and Spain now, but we looked at supply chains and we looked at localization. And what I will say is that COVID-19 brought a whole new investor into our business, which was the logistics chain. And they weren't paying anything, we just had to pay them. So the localization issue has become even more important. Logistics has got expensive. Supply chain guarantees aren't there. And we looked at this before COVID started. We started on hydrogen back in 2018. And we thought, how are we going to go into South Africa and get enough solar panels, enough lithium-ion batteries, enough wind masts, you know, besides the rest of this stuff. And we engaged really early with one of the largest solar panel manufacturers in the country, in the world rather, sorry, and one of the, and probably will be the largest by 2025, the largest lithium-ion battery manufacturer, and also one of the fastest growing EV vehicle companies. So I'm very proud to tell you today that they've confirmed they will be coming to South Africa. They will be putting up factories in Coca as a result of our investment. We're the anchor for them for solar panels. And I know that DTI has been chasing them for a number of years. So we, I suppose, can't take all the credit. So critically speaking, I think if anyone's going to come and develop a project here, you've got to make sure that the supply chain is already in place. And if it isn't, you've got to find it and make sure it's going to be there. So, you know, when we talk to wind turbine manufacturers, we are dealing with everybody at the moment. Towers are here. We've seen the factories reopening that make the towers down in Coca. Somerset East is talking about those big concrete towers. We know Atlantis has got plans. So the scale of what's happening in this country is attracting a natural investment just to bolster the ability to actually execute the projects. The long-term sustainability of that is why we are going to phase 2, 3, and 4. So it's not just Coca phase 1, it's Coca phase 2, 3, and 4. And we're seeing that in our discussions with Sasol. You know, I think Priscilla said to us, you know, we can just build as much as we can. That's the demand. So it's attracting investment for sure. I think we've been through REAP, and we've seen that's been a very unstable mechanism for people to invest because there were big gaps. This era now, this new green hydrogen era, opens up a whole raft of opportunity to invest in South Africa that we find incredibly exciting. So we've seen it from a holistic perspective, and it's actually taken our initial investment by knowing we can bring a company to South Africa who will invest in these desperately needed commodities just to get established. That's driven that investment more, and I think that applies to all the projects that we're seeing today.
No, thank you so much about that, Colin. And talking about commodities, Aldrich, you're giving me 100 tons, right? How can we think, Aldrich, of, you know, pricing in the upstream, you know, mechanisms, your steel, alumni, and others, and how they can then, you know, lead to the supporting of, you know, your downstream manufacturing of component parts and all of these. And of course, in the South African context, you know, one of the issues that we deal with a lot is this idea of local beneficiation. How can we ensure that local beneficiation takes precedence over the manufacturing, I mean, the exporting of raw materials? In your industry, of course, you've dealt with this a number of times. You've even asked DTIC to intervene with some tariffs on certain times. So, yeah, just those two questions.
No, thank you very much for that. And then Honorable Minister Patel, fellow panel members, and then ladies and gentlemen. Now, it's very difficult to be a steel maker and not at least be a little bit biased against aluminium specifically, but I'll try my best to remain impartial as I answer this question.
I think you are forced to be today.
Now, firstly, I think the price of steel and aluminium is important as an input towards these downstream component manufacturers. But even more important than that, and as my fellow panel members have alluded to, is actually sustained demand for these downstream components. And they've mentioned specifically if we cannot create this production capacity and not have a sustained demand. And at least if one looks at the South African ambition to install renewable energy, I can definitely argue and say that the demand is definitely on the horizon. And what we need to ensure is that we act upon that ambition. Now, if one looks at specifically aluminium and steel, they are critical in many different inputs in our life, whether it be packaging, transportation, construction, but most importantly, the green energy sector. And specifically in the solar PV area, every megawatt of solar PV will require between 40 and 60 tons of steel. Every megawatt of wind will require around 100 tons of steel. And if one looks at the South African ambition by 2030, we see that for us to reach our ambition, we require at least 17 gigawatts of solar and another 8 gigawatts of wind. And doing the calculation shows that we'll require at least 1.5 million tons of steel solutions by 2030. And of course, that will lead to an increase in demand for downstream products as well. So the demand is there. Well, the demand is on the horizon. It's really important that we act upon that and that there's sustained demand and that we ensure that our local industrial capacity is able to take advantage of this demand and receives that these components, that these inputs are locally manufactured because in the medium term it creates an important opportunity for us to really ensure that we localize this manufacturing, and it's an opportunity to incubate these factors, these specific inputs now or areas. Now looking at steel, very roughly about a megawatt of solar capacity could cost you circa $1.2 million. But if one considers the cost of the raw steel into that megawatt of solar PV, it only makes up about 2% of the actual project cost. So there's a real opportunity for us to look at localization, to consider and prioritize local steel, local downstream components, without having a massive impact on the actual profitability or viability of these kinds of, let's say, developments. And lastly, it's really important that we also work on some of the factors which impact the price of steel, but also the price of some of these downstream components, and that being the cost of logistics and, of course, the cost of energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to try and take some, I don't know, it looks like there was a VIP section at some point here with all these red things like you are in some club in Johannesburg. We don't have much time, colleagues. We've got about 15 minutes to just throw in some questions and comments to my panel. I'll try take 4 hands because it's important that we have a dynamic and wake-up moment. I see some people are starting to fall asleep. Okay, where do I start? Are we able to open this thing? So it's like a really important person coming through. Like, yeah. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Bakala Dabale, Program Leader for Sustainable Development Infrastructure from the World Bank. Very fascinating session. I wanted to ask a question to the broader panel, but more specifically to His Excellency Minister Patel. You spoke very passionately about South Africa's competitive and comparative advantage, which is very, very true. But it was also very true that when His Excellency the President spoke earlier, very interestingly, he spoke not only about South Africa, but also more broadly regional and the role that other countries could play. The critical minerals are available both in South Africa and neighboring countries. And I think South Africa obviously has that comparative and competitive advantage in terms of the technological, the fabrication and everything else that you talked about. But what would be very important is how does South Africa, both domestically, ensure coordination of the industrial policy, the labor policies, the fiscal policies that work in tandem that could advance South Africa's competitive advantage and also work with neighboring countries in order to facilitate that trade, logistics, and use the critical minerals that are not available in South Africa. I think this is a very, very important agenda, critically important. And if I look at some of the localization requirements and the BEs and everything else, I have yet to see a country that does not have a local requirement. But the way it is being done is not so much using a procurement to enforce localization, but use the capacity, those policies to build a local capacity to manufacture and service. And how does one ensure that? Thanks.
Thank you. Where else am I looking at? Just one. Going once, going twice. Sure, people really are looking forward to dinner tonight. Okay, Minister, maybe answer that one for now, because there are no other hands. And then let's see if there are other hands that come up for my other panelists. If not, I'll throw a provocative question to my panel.
Well, in order to avoid a provocative question to the panel, let me make a few remarks to the question. I think it was less a question and more a series of observations. There's no question about it. We've got to be able to package our storyline as an opportunity for the African continent. I remarked about Africa's development challenge, this challenge that is agreed across the continent that industrialization has to be the heart of what we do. And as I indicated earlier, we don't have the same very carbon-intensive growth path available to us if we are to be a responsible citizen globally that Europe followed. And for that reason, we need to position ourselves in two ways. The one is as a consumer of green hydrogen. So this is the fuel source. Green hydrogen plays the role that oil and coal played in the 20th century. It will begin to play increasingly in the 21st century. But off the back of that is the enormous opportunity then to localize the various supply chains. And I start that supply chain with R&D, not with widgets, and then moving progressively to all the widgets from fuel cell technologies we already produce in the Dube trade port through a company called Chem, a global company. We do these fuel cell technologies that go into the masts that are used by the mobile phone companies. We have an opportunity in electrolyzers. This is obviously a critical element of opportunity. We have it in, for example, we have a membrane electrode assembly operation that is being looked at for there are Tambo SEZ. There are opportunities in, of course, very importantly for us, ammonia cracking, and then the balance of plant and equipment. So this is where, say, an ArcelorMittal comes in, that the opportunities don't lie only in the green specific components, but it's in that ecosystem. What are the tools that you use? Well, I take a lot more flexible view than I think the representative of the World Bank may take. That you use whatever tools you have available, and every possible tool should be utilized. I've had conversations with my Chinese counterpart, my Indian counterpart, my American counterpart, European counterparts, counterparts on the African continent. And every country now recognizes the value and the importance of trying to find ways of building local industrial capability, often for very different reasons. In the US, their procurement budgets are absolute drivers. I mean, think about it. What they do with their defense budget has placed, as mobile phones we use, Mariana Matsukato is one of the president's advisors on the advisory panel, analyzed just a normal smartphone and looked at the investment by the public sector and the procurement offtake by the public sector that drove all of those critical technologies that were then commercialized. So we should not, however, limit ourselves only to procurement. There are a range of other ways in which we can make South Africa and the region and the continent a more attractive place, those critical mineral value chains. I've just had a comeback from a most fascinating conversation with Indonesia. Indonesia used to be one of the world's biggest nickel exporters. And they were doing something of the order of, call it between $2 and $3 billion worth of raw nickel exports. And they took a decision a couple of years ago, very unpopular decision, basically to shift into stainless steel production. And they used a range of tools to develop the stainless steel industry in Indonesia. Today, they have an industry with an export of more than $20 billion. They anticipate by this year or next year, it may get to $30 billion. Now look at that multiplier that has come out of transformation of raw materials that Indonesia had, that historically just exported in raw form. And through a careful blend of policy elements, it was able to attract investment from different parts of the world. Particularly, it was a major supplier to China, and it was able to encourage those Chinese companies to locate in Indonesia and utilize the raw material base.
Okay.
Now, I give that as an example of what we can do to illustrate the need to think in a flexible way and to think and not to limit ourselves. We're in an age where we can think a little bit more imaginatively.
Okay, thank you, Minister. You're really trying to save the panel from a provocative question. So I just need to make sure I can still squeeze one if there's a need to. I can take two hands now because we're going to wrap up, and then I'll make a nice announcement. Okay. I feel intimidated. You woke up.
Thanks, Lukwan. And thanks to the panelists for an informative discussion. My name is Tabang Tladi from Infrastructure South Africa. My question is actually to Mahendra because of a statement he made in the previous session that we had about financing projects around the ecosystem and the role of SMMEs. And I'd like him to just unpack it further because my understanding from his comment was that he sees SMMEs playing a much bigger role in the value chain system in supporting the development of projects in the manufacturing, et cetera. So just to unpack it because of the complexities as well that SMMEs face in raising finance to be able to play in such a nascent industry, and whether, you know, as IDC, what role would you be looking at playing in supporting them? Thanks.
You know, it's like when the priest is about to say grace at church and people say, but you didn't pray for me, come, give me.
Thank you. Lawrence Sluter from the Rebel Group Advisory Southern Africa. Both Minister Patel and Mahendra alluded to innovation and R&D. And Minister also mentioned Mariana Mazzucato, who's famous for the mission-orientated policy. And I was reading this morning that Chile regards their hydrogen strategy as part of a mission-orientated policy. So, I mean, I'm personally very pleased that you mentioned those aspects in the context of industrialization, because I think R&D is important both for the innovation part, but also for absorbing technologies that comes from elsewhere. But what I wanted to ask you, do you think we're doing enough on R&D and innovation in the green hydrogen space, or should we be doing more? Should it be at the scale when we were doing the pebble bed modular reactor, or maybe even in the bad old apartheid days, the way that they spent on defense technology? Should this be our overall mission, and should we direct a lot more of our R&D resources to learn how to build electrolyzers and better Haber-Bosch plants and so on? Just some comments on that.
I nearly answered you, and then I remembered that I'm not part of the panel, so I'll behave. But I'm also going to ask this question as part of our parting shot to everybody. So we talk a lot about all of these things: R&D, local beneficiation, local manufacturing, and everything needs money. Definitely IDC does not have enough of that money, nor the sister DFIs of IDC. What is going to be the best way to pool resources as we think of this work? I'll start with you. I'll leave the minister for last because he had to answer a lot in the last round. So Mahendra, I'll start off with you, then Thabo, Colin, and Aldrich, and then minister will close off, and then I'll make an announcement before we all go out.
Thanks, but first I need to address Tabang's question. It's an unfair question because that was the previous panel. So you just bring...
It's the same conference, don't worry.
He came to your rescue. So extremely important, the role of SMMEs. Extremely important. And we need to firstly recognize it's not an industry we're creating only for big players. Right? I mentioned the interdependency. So we both need each other. We need to have that mindset as a start. Right? The big players will help to set up the industry, but they need the small players to come on board. Both need each other. So that's the first point, is the interdependency, but how you actually look at it is very much understanding the cross-sectorial impacts. It's not, as the Minister mentioned, it's not only about the fuel cells, nice electrolyzers, that's important, but if you look at the cross-sectorial impact with the battery value chain, renewable value chain, there's the nuts and bolt components, there's cables, right? All of that is linked with you know, the broader energy industry, and it's all linked with the hydrogen. So when you recognize that cross-sectoral impact, you can get that economies of scale in. That's going to help your SMMEs. It gives them a bigger demand pull. So it's facilitating those linkages that's important, and ensuring that they are part of the supply chain in those areas also. So yeah, and I think the other important part, I mean, we talk about green hydrogen, creating this new industry. It's not only about, you know, your electrolyzers and fuel cells. Any new industry you create has to come with digitization right now, right? And with digitization, we know that's where you get a lot of the small players involved, which can really build up, right? In terms of things like software services, etc. So I think that's the other key part of how we need to ensure that we get those smaller players involved. So hopefully that answers your question, Tabang. But then I forgot the facilitator's questions.
The stuff where the money is going to come from for all of this. I mean, there doesn't seem to be enough money present. So where are we going to pool resources for all of this work?
So so going to back to the previous panel, we all agreed there is enough money, but it's not about whether it's not available or not. It's about how we pull it together. And I think your question is about how we align on that common vision and start really implementing and making those investments. So I think that's the first thing, is getting the alignment from the funding side, right? We've been, you know, we started now working closely amongst the DFIs, for example, in getting alignment. And this question was posed on, you know, do we have a set of criteria that we look at that's aligned between all the parties. So what happens is that clients of applicants come to the DFIs for funding, but they end up going to different DFIs with different criteria. And we recognize that that doesn't help. We need to move with speed. So we have now started a forum where DFIs will get aligned on the criteria. So when a party comes to one or two of us, they're not getting a totally different story on what's required.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the first things. The second step will then be to align that with the commercial banks.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That might be a bigger leap. Thabo.
So I think parting comments for me is that I think where we sit with a very unique opportunity. And we had this conversation with Adrian yesterday in Saldanha at his plant, is that there's so much demand of green hydrogen that I don't think we are competing. We will need a lot of players to come and play into this space. And South Africa is uniquely positioned. We use PEM electrolyzers. The PGMs are quite critical for us as we scale up to industrial scale. So that conversation would happen with South Africa because that's the center where it comes from. And we have an experience with renewable energies in South Africa. The skill set exists, the mechanisms to unearth those projects exist. So we've got that going for us. The hydrogen space, HISA has been there for some time. That investment was done by the country, and we have various players like ourselves who can play a part within that. So I just think that in the holistic value chain of the green hydrogen, we are perfectly positioned as South Africa to play a leading role, if you like, within the southern or sub-Saharan Africa as well. But I think when we get into the question around localization, we then have to think a bit broader. I think it is also not about perhaps the PEM electrolyzer itself, because there's other accompanying parts and elements around it. And I mean, recently we did some work when we re-looked at the green hydrogen itself and where localization opportunities. We came with about 40 to 60% of the green hydrogen system itself could be localized. And that's just off the initial calculation. So that tells us there's a lot more opportunities that we can unearth, and I think South Africa is best placed to take that.
Thank you so much for that, Colin.
Well, I'd like to perhaps change the tone a little bit and say, you said from Hive's perspective, where's the money coming from? The money's coming from conscience in our case. We've got an owner, single person owns the whole company, who has a conscience about the climate. He wants to make a positive legacy contribution to something that will be meaningful in climate change. That is what drives us. That drives us every day. That's what we talk about all the time. And then we make the funding fit. And we have many, many discussions with the DFIs. I think they're quite unaligned at the moment, but we're seeing the clubbing starting to take place. We're seeing DFIs talking to each other now, and that's a really positive thing for global change. I think there's big inhibitors for developing countries. We look at the Renewable Energy Directive come out of EU. It's pretty draconian. We're following it, but it's a heavy burden. And to get the funding right, you are going through hoops, a lot of hoops. We spend a lot of time on that. And I think that's the inevitable piece that we've got to focus on. But we should never lose sight of what's driving this. The driver is the desperate need for proper positive climate mitigation and climate change mitigation. And that's what gets us out of bed.
You know, Colin, I thought that some people would clap out of surprise a business that talk about conscience, but clearly, I don't know if people have lost hope or they didn't hear you properly there. Your comments as we close and on this particular topic.
No, I think as a steel industry, we recognize in terms of enabling this transformation, partnership is imperative. And we've announced a partnership with SASL, and already there's discussions with other parties that are really looking to come on board to enable the transformation, because what we see is, from a steel industry perspective, only 1/3 of the capital cost will be spent on the actual steelmaking facility to transform it to a new green steelmaking process or decarbonized process. 2/3 of that will be the renewable energy, the carbon capture equipment, as well as the electrolyzers that will supply the hydrogen to transforming the specific plant. So in terms of enabling or making available the necessary funding, we believe that it's a joint approach. It will only be enabled through partnership, and we're really excited by the willingness of parties to come together to approach this crisis as a combined unit, more as a coalition of the willing.
Thank you so much, Minister Patel. I'll give you the last 2 minutes to round us off and then make an announcement to our attendees.
Where will the money come from? In the negotiation with the International Partnership Group, the countries that are backing a joint approach to funding, we've put green hydrogen as one of the 3 elements that need to be in that package. A lot more would need to be done. We are now in conversation with more countries, and also with those countries about a second tranche. But capital markets themselves will increasingly be under pressure to be able to fund a more sustainable set of energy solutions for the world. So it's not just government mobilized resources, but also the enormous potential that can be unlocked in those private capital markets. A very interesting question from the gentleman from Rebel. Are we doing enough? The short answer is no. More can be done. Not all of it is more money. A lot of it is better coordination. And we've learned from some things that we've done well, and we've learned from some things we didn't do well. SASL was a very good example of highly coordinated effort that got a world-class technology out of it. Another great example has been in the COVID period. South Africa, at the start of the COVID period, had virtually no ability to do most of the things that were necessary. We were able afterwards to build up a massive export capability in hand sanitizer, medical grade masks. We produced our own designed ventilator, and we now produce, we're the biggest J&J contract producer in the world, and we're doing the Pfizer vaccine. There's one example of how not to do it, and that was renewable energy. The IDC put an enormous amount of money, at the moment about 14 billion rand, into backing the renewable energy program at the start. And that was necessary. It was a vital contribution, but it lost sight of the need to build in a localization strategy. So we ended up with a lot of money spent, but very little ability to see the generation of industrial activity out of it. So we're learning from that. And green hydrogen provides an opportunity not to become simply transactional, but to have a strategy that underpins all of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Patel. A big round of applause for the panel. That was, of course, building sustainable value chains for a green industrialization. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm told that you are invited to a light dinner. Don't know how light, don't ask me. Bring your light stomach. It starts at 4:30. Well, that is already into it, at the square, and I'm told that is the white marquee across the conference venue. All are invited. No gold tags, green tags, white tags, don't worry. You will just get in if you are part of this summit. And I suppose that is a good afternoon to all of you. We will meet again at the networking dinner session outside. If not, we shall see each other tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
We would like to take this opportunity to thank the sponsors. The Green Hydrogen Summit South Africa 2022 Cape Town was sponsored by SASL, Anglo-American, Aqua Power, Industrial Development Corporation, the Northern Cape Province, Western Cape Government, and Wesgrow. in partnership with the Republic of South Africa, German Corporation, Infrastructure South Africa, and the Digital Council.